November 12, 1942, Western Desert, North Africa. An abandoned American vehicle sat by the wreckage of a British supply column. Its crew had fled once their position became hopeless. Standard Wehrmacht practice called for destroying captured equipment or leaving it, but the reconnaissance unit's commander had different plans. Fetch our best mechanic. I want to know if this is usable. What the Africa Corps mechanics learned in the following half hour would overturn their assumptions about German technical supremacy. The insight did not hit all at once, but crept up on them as they examined the vehicle piece by piece. A small plate on the dashboard read, Willys MB. The Americans called it a Jeep. The first surprise came when they popped the hood. The engine bay was spotless and laid out for quick servicing by someone with only basic mechanical skills, color-coded wires, clearly marked parts, and components reachable without special tools. In 2 decades of working on German military vehicles, the senior mechanic had never encountered such deliberately maintenance-friendly design. Every bolt followed a standard, every part matched those on the other machines of the same model. Everything pointed to mass production thinking and easy interchangeability. The Go Devil engine displaced 134 cubic inches and made 60 horsepower at 4,000 RPM. Not outstanding by German benchmarks, but the design philosophy behind it was the revelation. This motor wasn't intended to be an engineering marvel. It was meant to be straightforward, dependable, and above all, easy to produce. A minimally trained mechanic could service it with ordinary tools. No special wrenches, no factory-only procedures. The Americans had clearly expected farmers and factory hands to maintain these vehicles under combat. Stress. By November 1942, the contrast between American and German approaches to military vehicles was glaring. The United States would build over 640,000 Jeeps during the war. Germany managed just over 50,000 Kubalvar. Worse than the numbers was what they signified. The Jeep exemplified American manufacturing principles, standardized, simplified, mass-producible by semi-skilled labor using interchangeable parts. Officers arrived as the mechanics worked. "Can we use it?" someone asked. The senior mechanic looked up, weighing his reply. "This machine is remarkable. It's made by people who understand service conditions." One officer scowled. "German engineering is the finest in the world." The mechanic didn't argue. He only pointed at the four-wheel drive mechanism. "Look at this transfer case. One lever engages four-wheel drive, one lever. Our Kubalv wagons need several steps, and many don't even have four-wheel drive. The Wehrmacht's standard light vehicle, the Volkswagen Type 82 Kubalvar, was excellent in many respects. Ferdinand Porsche had designed it with meticulous German care. It was lighter than the Jeep, consumed less fuel, and its air-cooled engine avoided the vulnerability of radiators. But it had a fatal shortcoming. It was rear-wheel drive only. In the soft sands of North Africa, the mountains of Italy, and the mud of Russia, that limitation was disastrous. The Jeep, by contrast, could deliver power to all four wheels whenever necessary, and the mechanism was so simple, an untrained soldier could master it in minutes. The mechanics kept inspecting. The Jeep used basic leaf springs for suspension, cruder than the Kubalwagen's refined torsion bars, but vastly easier to repair in the field. Its electrical system was simple yet sturdy. The fuel system tolerated almost any grade of gasoline without modification. Most alarming to the German crew was the Jeep's weight distribution. The Jeep weighed roughly 2,450 versus the Kubalvar's 1,540, a difference of 9/10. German engineers would see that as inefficiency, more weight, lower performance, higher fuel use, but the mechanics spotted the intent behind the apparent excess. That extra mass meant toughness. The frame was overbuilt to endure abuse that would wreck lighter vehicles. The Americans had prioritized durability under misuse and overload over theoretical efficiency, building a vehicle to survive conditions no engineer would normally endorse. This was not the ineptitude Wehrmacht propaganda had mocked. It was practical engineering focused on real-world use rather than idealized theory. The unit hauled the Jeep back to their forward area, and over the next 3 days the mechanics put it through exhaustive trials. They drove it across soft sand where kubalvarans bogged down, overloaded it beyond rated limits, and beat on it in ways that would have disabled most other machines. The Jeep took it all. In loose terrain that trapped rear-wheel drive vehicles, the Jeep simply pushed forward. Its low-range gearing let it crawl over obstacles at walking pace, something the kubalvarans' gearing, even with reduction hubs, could not match. Word spread through the Afrika Korps. The Americans had produced a vehicle that beat the German counterpart on nearly every practical measure, and word spread quickly. Officers and mechanics from other units came to inspect it, reacting in a familiar sequence. Doubt at first, then reluctant admiration, and finally alarm as the broader consequences sank in. A supply officer who had worked in German auto plants before the war took a long look and delivered a stark verdict. This reveals a basic difference in philosophy. We design vehicles to achieve engineering perfection, he said, while the Americans designed them to be manufactured en masse, and in a total war that distinction is decisive. He pointed out the cast engine block, traded off tolerances for vastly faster production, and explained that a semi-skilled factory worker could assemble these engines in a fraction of the time required for a German unit. He gestured at the stamped body panels, crude by German standards but producible in enormous numbers by factories that once turned out household goods. The United States had mobilized its entire industrial base, refrigerator plants, washing machine shops, commercial vehicle makers, switching them to military output in ways Germany could not match. When he finished speaking, the room fell quiet. He had named what many already suspected. Germany's insistence on precision and quality worked in peacetime. But the American emphasis on adequate, fast, standardized production was proving devastatingly effective under wartime conditions. That night, one of the mechanics wrote a meticulous technical report cataloging the Jeep's design, its strengths, and its faults. That report joined thousands of similar assessments flowing into German technical intelligence channels from every front, and they painted a disturbing picture. Allied output vastly outpaced Axis production. In late 1942, a formal study confirmed the fear. American factories were turning out military vehicles by the thousands daily. Ford's Willow Run plant was churning out B-24 Liberator bombers at a blistering rate. Liberty ships were rolling off slips faster than Germany could sink them. And 1942 U.S. vehicle production already exceeded the combined totals of Germany, Italy, and Japan, while output continued to accelerate. The captured Jeep quickly became famous within the unit. Soldiers vied for the chance to drive it. Officers trusted it for reconnaissance more than their own machines. And worn parts were scavenged from other captured Jeeps with alarming ease, because everything was interchangeable. By early 1943, the Afrika Korps had seized dozens of Jeeps, and German mechanics formed informal networks to trade repair tips and salvaged parts. A black market sprang up for captured American vehicles, and a working Jeep could fetch prices far above its nominal value because everyone recognized how well it performed in desert conditions. On May 13, 1943, when the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia and roughly 250,000 German and Italian troops became prisoners, the captives' schooling in American industrial power only intensified during the journey to captivity. They watched American trucks ferry prisoners in numbers that would have required teams of horse-drawn wagons in German service. Liberty ships, which at peak took only 5 to 6 weeks to build in 1943 compared with months earlier, carried thousands across the Atlantic. And every logistical detail at the prisoner processing center in Oran, Algeria, demonstrated an organizational scale Germany had not matched. Captured mechanics observed U.S. motorpool sergeants servicing fleets with casual efficiency that would have been impossible in the Wehrmacht. Dozens of Jeeps, trucks, and staff cars were kept running by young soldiers who worked quickly and confidently with abundant tools and ready parts. And replacement components arrived without bureaucratic delay, because commonality of parts meant any vehicle could be repaired without specialized knowledge. One American sergeant who spoke passable German noticed a watching German mechanic and invited him into the motorpool, explaining bluntly that everything was built so any farm boy could fix it. Color-coded wiring, standardized bolts, plainly labeled parts, and maintenance manuals written for very low reading levels so even minimally trained men could follow the steps. When the German asked how many were produced, the sergeant shrugged and guessed thousands every week. There were simply so many Jeeps coming off production lines that often the practical response to a breakdown was to swap in another vehicle rather than repair the old one immediately. The evidence was everywhere at that forward supply base. Dodge trucks that could haul loads German vehicles needed 2 rigs for, half-tracks produced in quantities that made German equivalents rare, and tank transporters that moved armor without wearing out their tracks. The real secret, the sergeant explained, was component commonality. A bolt from a Jeep fit a truck fit a half-track. The same electrical and hydraulic parts recurred across platforms. That simplification cut the number of unique parts from thousands to a few hundred items manufactured by the millions, creating a logistical ecosystem where any part could be used anywhere and any mechanic could service almost any vehicle. The prisoners' trip from North Africa to U.S. camps continued the lesson. At each stop, they encountered American production and transport systems operating at a scale that shattered prior German assumptions. Norfolk's port handled tons of supplies daily with mechanical precision. Cranes and cargo handling far outpaced anything in Hamburg. Trains moved prisoners in comfort that German rail rarely matched. And depot yards held thousands of military vehicles awaiting shipment. At Camp Hearn, Texas, German mechanics volunteered in the motorpool and worked alongside American soldiers for the next 2 years, maintaining the vehicles that kept the camp functioning. There, they learned firsthand the American approach. Maintenance driven by practicality rather than engineering idealism. Fix it fast with whatever's on hand. Improvise when parts are missing, cannibalize irreparable machines for spares, and request replacements that arrived in days instead of weeks. German techs, trained to meet factory tolerances with special tools and exact procedures, found themselves contrasted with American maintainers whose goal was simply to keep equipment running by any feasible means. In peacetime, the German methods produced finer results, but in wartime, the Americans' pragmatic, production-driven system proved far more effective. In the disorder of war, American practices proved far more effective. At Camp Hearn, the motorpool turned hundreds of vehicles through maintenance each month. Jeeps came in for routine work, were serviced in hours instead of days, and returned to duty. That speed came from plentiful spare parts and interchangeable components. When a piece needed replacing, the parts room held dozens. When a special tool was required, the tool room supplied it at once. When a vehicle was beyond repair, another one simply took its place. A German mechanic struck up a friendship with an American who had worked at Ford before the conflict. "I was on the Willow Run line," the American said. "That's Ford's bomber plant outside Detroit, the biggest factory around. We began B-24 production in 1942, and by the time I was drafted, we were finishing 1 bomber every hour." The scale staggered the listener. 24 bombers a day, hundreds a month. The explanation was mass production principles. Break complex assemblies into simple, repeatable tasks so unskilled workers can be trained quickly to do one operation reliably. Train 1,000 people to perform one small job and output multiplies. This contrasted with German practice, which depended on skilled craftsmen producing high-quality items in limited numbers. American factories used semi-skilled labor to turn out adequate machines in vastly larger quantities. The same logic applied to Jeeps. Willys made them, Ford made them, and both followed the same specifications, so parts and entire vehicles were interchangeable. If one plant were damaged, the other kept supplying replacements. Mechanics learned a single common vehicle instead of dozens of variants, which made maintenance straightforward. The German pondered his forces' inventory. Dozens of truck models from different manufacturers, command cars from varied sources, captured vehicles from across the continent, each with its own spares and procedures. German logistics were a tangle of incompatible systems. American logistics were simplified by uniformity. The Jeep program's requirements in 1940 gave manufacturers just weeks to produce prototypes, and companies responded with rapid, production-minded designs. Simplicity of manufacture, ease of maintenance, and straightforward repair were built in from the outset. The captured mechanics had inspected enough Jeeps to see the point. The vehicle sacrificed elegance for producibility, and in a total war that trade-off won. By the summer of 1944, rumors of the Allied invasion reached the camps, and when news confirmed the Normandy landings, few were surprised. The Allies possessed the industrial base to assemble an invasion fleet that Germany could not hope to match in years. Thousands of landing craft, vehicles and supplies moved across the channel in the initial assault. Reports described thousands of vehicles in the first waves, jeeps, trucks, tanks, amphibious craft, all carried on landing ships and barges built in huge numbers. The scale, thousands of ships and aircraft and hundreds of thousands of men in the opening assault, made clear how production, not just tactics, shaped the outcome. In the motor pool one afternoon, prisoners watched Americans load dozens of jeeps onto transporters for shipment to Europe. A private drove each vehicle up the ramps with easy confidence, and the whole job finished in less than an hour. A German mechanic realized that one loading operation at a single camp in Texas represented more vehicles than his entire North African division had possessed. That scene was multiplied across depots and ports every day. The arithmetic was unavoidable. Germany had mobilized its industry but still produced fewer than 100,000 military vehicles of all kinds in 1943, while the United States produced over 2 million that year. The gap was not only one of quantity but of design philosophy. American vehicles emphasized serviceability, common parts, simple operation, and toughness. German machines were engineered to peacetime specifications that proved ill-suited to prolonged, resource-strained conflict. When news of the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, reached the camps, reports showed Germany lacked fuel to sustain its attack, and even resorted to using seized American equipment in infiltration efforts. Attempts to disguise units with captured jeeps, uniforms, and papers failed when American MPs detected inconsistencies. The offensive stalled largely because supply collapsed and fuel ran out, forcing armor to be abandoned and infantry to rely on horse transport. By early 1945, the attack had been contained and reversed. Spring brought reports of Germany's final collapse as Soviet forces closed on Berlin and Western allies drove inward. Throughout this period, the German mechanics working in American motor pools learned by doing. They saw maintenance organized around keeping machines moving rather than meeting factory tolerances. Fix problems fast with available tools. Improvise when parts were missing. Cannibalize dead vehicles for spares. And replace irreparable machines quickly. Manuals were simple, parts common, and logistics geared to rapid turnaround. The German technicians admitted they had been mistaken. Before the war, they had equated German engineering superiority with guaranteed victory. But the Jeep taught them otherwise. German quality was real, but American quantity combined with practical design for the battlefield proved decisive. When the surrender came, the mechanics accepted that defeat stemmed not from a lack of bravery or skill, but from being outproduced by an opponent whose industrial capacity and pragmatic design philosophy Germany could not match. They left the camps to a homeland shattered by the very manufacturing power that had produced the vehicles they had studied. When an American asked one of them whether he had ever believed Germany could win, the mechanic answered honestly that before the war he had. After inspecting that first Jeep in 1942, he understood the mistake. He had confused peacetime excellence with wartime effectiveness. The Jeep was not a superior technical masterpiece in every respect, but it was built to be made and fixed in vast numbers under combat conditions. And in total war, that made all the difference. They stood quietly for a few moments, two technicians from opposite armies brought together by a shared recognition of what had really decided the war. Repatriation began in late 1945, and German POWs boarded ships for home. One mechanic reached Bremerhaven in January 1946, passed through Allied checkpoints, and was released into a city of ruins. Rubble lay everywhere. Yet amid the devastation he noticed an unmistakable presence. American vehicles operating throughout the shattered streets, jeeps ferrying Allied officers, trucks distributing relief, and motorpools where German civilians worked alongside Allied soldiers. Approaching one motorpool, he introduced himself to the American captain in charge in the limited English he'd learned during captivity. "Sir, I am a former Oberfeldwebel of the Africa Corps, recently repatriated from Camp Hearn, Texas. I am a trained vehicle mechanic with experience on American equipment. Are you hiring civilian workers?" The captain glanced at his papers. "You worked in our motorpool in Texas?" 2 years, and then said they desperately needed mechanics. Most German technicians were dead or still interned. He could start the next day, paid in occupation script for rations and essentials. Thus, the former Africa Corps mechanic found himself employed by the army he had opposed, maintaining the same vehicles he once studied as enemy hardware. The Allies needed skilled hands. He needed work. Life went on. Over the next months, he watched Germany's Reconstruction begin, fueled by American aid delivered with the same logistical competence that had helped win the war. Food, medicine, building materials arriving in U.S. trucks coordinated by planners who rebuilt systematically. He trained young Germans in American maintenance methods. Many were ex-Wehrmacht men who now required civilian skills, teaching the lessons the Jeeps had taught him. Favor simplicity over needless complexity, practicality over perfection, outcomes over theory. By 1947, he had been promoted to supervise the German civilian staff in the motorpool. The American captain valued his experience and treated him with respect. One evening, the captain asked what a vehicle for the new Germany should be like. He thought carefully and answered that he would adapt American principles to European needs. Smaller and more fuel-efficient than a Jeep, but following the same philosophy of standardized parts. Easy servicing and manufacturability rather than engineering showpieces. Europe's narrow roads and scarce fuel required adaptation, but the core idea, designed for production and field repair, remained. The captain agreed. Marshall Plan funds would rebuild German industry, and engineers were already studying American methods. That prediction came true. In the following decades, West German industry merged U.S. mass production practices with German precision, igniting an economic revival that turned a ruined country into an industrial power. Firms like Volkswagen, once the wartime maker of the Kübelwagen, reinvented themselves by blending German engineering with assembly line efficiency. The Beetle became a bestseller because it was simple, reliable, cheap to make, and affordable. Former Wehrmacht mechanics returning from American motorpools brought back vital know-how, standardized components, streamlined parts distribution, simplified maintenance routines, and the concept of designing for mass production rather than perfection. Those practical lessons reshaped German automotive design for decades. By the early 1950s, the hybrid approach paid off. Volkswagen's output rose from a few thousand cars a year to hundreds of thousands. Mercedes-Benz integrated assembly line methods while keeping quality high. BMW reorganized production to share common parts across models. The Wirtschaftswunder of the 1950s and 1960s owed much to this synthesis, producing export vehicles that married durability and affordability in ways neither pre-war philosophy could have achieved alone. U.S. Army historian Hugh M. Cole, who interviewed German generals after surrender, recorded their view. They admired the Jeep above almost every other American weapon because it symbolized the manufacturing doctrine that had won the war. Even General George C. Marshall called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare, an assessment that reflected how standardization, simplification, production-driven design, and rugged reliability reshaped military logistics and post-war industry alike. By November 1943, the U.S. Army had gathered enough material on captured Kübelwagens to publish Technical Manual TME 9803, a comprehensive guide to their operation and upkeep. It was released on June 6, 1944, D-Day, so that American forces landing in France could make use of any captured vehicles. The Wehrmacht never produced a comparable manual for the Jeep, and they did not need to. The Jeep's layout and simplicity made it intuitive for any mechanic to grasp, while the Kübelwagen's more intricate systems demanded detailed documentation and translation for foreign mechanics to understand. That contrast highlighted the deeper design divide. One vehicle required extensive manuals and specialized knowledge. The other required little instruction at all. Reunions of Africa Corps veterans began in the 1960s. At a 1967 gathering, a former mechanic summarized the consensus. The Kübelwagen was finely engineered, light, fuel-efficient, and well-suited to desert use thanks to its air-cooled engine. But the Jeep was better suited to modern, large-scale war because of four-wheel drive, easy upkeep, common parts, and crucially, producibility at scales Germany could not match. An old reconnaissance commander recalled capturing his first Jeep and initially dismissing it as crude. Only later did they realize that its straightforwardness was a form of elegant efficiency. By 1943, every unit wanted captured Jeeps because they performed far better under combat conditions. Another veteran recalled the crushing moment when he learned that America produced more Jeeps in a single week than Germany made Kübelwagens. In an entire year, an arithmetic realization that signaled defeat not through a single battle but through logistics. The Allies could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. That view became common. German soldiers respected the Kübelwagen's engineering, yet they understood that the Jeep symbolized the industrial gap between the sides. Germany's logistical woes were severe. By 1943, roughly 80% of German divisions relied on horse-drawn transport. The army entered the war with about 514,000 horses and ultimately used some 2.75 million horses and mules. Around 1.1 million were typically in service at any time, and over 2 million animals died during the conflict. American divisions, by contrast, were fully motorized and depended on trucks for supply, granting operational mobility German commanders envied. U.S. supply columns could cover hundreds of kilometers a day. German columns, limited by horse pace, averaged perhaps 30 kilometers daily in good conditions. When Wehrmacht leaders analyzed why they lost, material inferiority, not courage, tactics, or leadership, was their chief explanation. Soldiers fought well and officers usually made sound tactical choices, but German industry could not produce enough equipment to sustain a prolonged war against opponents with overwhelming production capacity. The Jeep became the emblem of that discrepancy, because every German who encountered one understood what it stood for. They stood quiet for a few seconds. 2. Technicians from opposing armies bound by a shared realization of what had truly decided the conflict. Repatriation began in late 1945 and German POWs boarded ships for home. One mechanic arrived in Bremerhaven in January 1946, passed Allied checkpoints and stepped into a city of ruins. Rubble lay everywhere, yet amid the destruction he noticed a striking fact. American vehicles operated throughout the shattered streets, jeeps ferrying Allied officers, trucks delivering relief, motorpools where German civilians worked side by side with Allied troops. He approached one motorpool and, using the English he'd learned in captivity, introduced himself to the American captain in charge. "Sir, I'm a former Oberfeldwebel of the Africa Corps, just repatriated from Camp Hearn, Texas. I'm a trained vehicle mechanic familiar with American equipment. Are you hiring civilian workers?" The captain checked his papers. "You worked in our motorpool in Texas?" 2 years? Then nodded. They were desperate for mechanics. Most German technicians had died or remained interned. He could start the next day, paid an occupation script redeemable for rations and essentials. Thus, the ex-Africa Corps mechanic found work for the army he had fought, maintaining the very vehicles he once studied as enemy hardware. The Allies needed hands, he needed employment, and life moved forward. Over the following months, he watched Germany begin to rebuild, with American aid arriving and being distributed with the same organizational skill that had helped win the war. Food, medicine, and building materials unloaded from U.S. trucks coordinated by planners who approached Reconstruction systematically. He trained young Germans in American maintenance methods. Many were former Wehrmacht men who now needed civilian skills. Teaching lessons learned from the Jeeps. Choose simplicity over needless complexity. Prioritize practical function over theoretical perfection. And aim for tangible results rather than aesthetic engineering. By 1947, he was promoted to supervisor of the motorpool's German civilian crew. The American captain respected his experience and one evening asked what a vehicle for the new Germany should look like. He replied that he would adapt the American approach for European conditions, smaller and more fuel-efficient than a Jeep, but following the same philosophy. Common parts, easy servicing, and designs geared for manufacture rather than engineering showpieces. Europe's narrow roads and scarce fuel required modification, but the essential idea, designed for production and field repair, remained. The captain agreed. Marshall Plan funds would rebuild German industry, and engineers were already studying American methods. That prediction came true. In subsequent decades, West German industry combined U.S. mass production practices with German precision, triggering an economic revival that turned a wrecked country into an industrial power. Companies like Volkswagen, once makers of the Kübelwagen, reinvented themselves by marrying German engineering with assembly line efficiency. The Volkswagen Beetle became a global bestseller because it was simple, dependable, cheap to produce, and affordable. Former Wehrmacht mechanics who worked in American motorpools returned with crucial know-how. Standardization of components, efficient parts distribution, simplified maintenance routines, and the principle of designing for manufacturability rather than perfection. And those hard-earned lessons reshaped German automotive design for decades. By the early 1950s, the hybrid model paid off. Volkswagen grew from making a few thousand cars a year to producing hundreds of thousands. Mercedes-Benz embraced assembly line methods while keeping quality high. BMW reorganized production to share parts across models. The Wirtschaftswunder of the 1950s and 1960s owed much to this synthesis, producing export vehicles that combined durability and affordability in ways neither pre-war doctrine could have achieved alone. U.S. Army historian Hugh M. Cole, who interviewed German generals after surrender, recorded their view. They admired the Jeep above nearly every other American weapon because it symbolized the manufacturing approach that had won the war. Even General George C. Marshall called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare, a recognition that standardization, simplification, production-oriented design, and rugged reliability reshaped military logistics and post-war industry alike. By November 1943, the U.S. Army had gathered enough material on captured Kübelwagens to publish Technical Manual, TME 9803, a full guide to operating and maintaining German vehicles. It was released on June 6, 1944, D-Day, so American forces landing in France could make use of any captured machines. The Wehrmacht never produced a comparable manual for the Jeep, nor did it need to. The Jeep's simplicity made it intuitive for any mechanic to use and service, while the Kübelwagen's more intricate systems required detailed documentation and translation for foreign hands. That contrast exposed the deeper design divide. One vehicle demanded elaborate manuals and specialist knowledge. The other needed little instruction at all. Reunions of Africa Corps veterans began in the 1960s. At a 1967 gathering, a former mechanic summed up the consensus. The Kübelwagen was well engineered, light, fuel-efficient, and effective in desert conditions thanks to its air-cooled motor. But the Jeep was better suited to modern, large-scale war because of four-wheel drive, easy upkeep, common parts, and, crucially, producibility at scales Germany could not match. An old reconnaissance commander recalled capturing his first Jeep and dismissing it as crude. Only later did they see that its simplicity was a kind of elegant efficiency. By 1943, every unit coveted captured Jeeps because they worked far better in combat. Another veteran remembered the crushing realization that America could produce more Jeeps in a week than Germany made Kübelwagens in a year, an arithmetic truth that meant defeat by attrition rather than a single lost battle. That realization became widespread. German soldiers respected the Kübelwagen's engineering, yet they understood the Jeep symbolized the industrial gap between the sides. Germany's logistical troubles were severe. By 1943, roughly 80% of German divisions still depended on horse-drawn transport. The army entered the war with about 514,000 horses and ultimately used some 2.75 million horses and mules. Roughly 1.1 million were in service at any time, and over 2 million animals died during the conflict. American divisions were fully motorized and relied on trucks for supply, giving operational mobility German commanders envied. U.S. supply columns could cover hundreds of kilometers a day. German columns, limited by horse pace, managed perhaps 30 kilometers daily in good conditions. When Wehrmacht leaders assessed why they lost, they pointed to material shortfall rather than failures of courage or tactics. Soldiers fought bravely and officers made sound tactical choices, but German industry could not produce enough equipment to sustain a war against opponents with vast production superiority. The Jeep became the emblem of that imbalance because every German who encountered one grasped what it represented. Here was a vehicle so plentiful, Americans treated it as nearly disposable. So dependable it required minimal upkeep, so straightforward any soldier could run and repair it, and so effective that German units preferred captured Jeeps over their own machines whenever possible. In 1976, the U.S. Army began replacing the Jeep with the HMMMWV after 35 years of service, an extraordinary lifespan for a military vehicle, and many remained in reserve and allied service for decades thereafter. That same year, Volkswagen marked the millionth Golf produced. Like the Beetle before it, the Golf reflected lessons drawn from both German and American practice. Precision engineering married to mass production efficiency, the synthesis that had helped rebuild Germany. By the 1980s, West Germany was among the world's leading economies, and its carmakers exported millions of vehicles annually. German manufacturing became synonymous with quality and reliability, but that reputation now rested on efficient production methods heavily. Influenced by American ideas, the final Africa Corps reunion took place in 1998, with fewer than 24 veterans in their 70s and 80s. At the museum where a restored Willys MB was displayed, they clustered around the Jeep, these old soldiers who had once fought in Africa, inspecting it with the eyes of mechanics and veterans who had come to respect it. One reached out and ran arthritic fingers over the hood. I captured one of these in '42, used it for 3 months before I was wounded at El Alamein. Best vehicle I ever drove. Better than anything we had. Another agreed. I looked at one in Tunisia before we surrendered. Couldn't believe how simple it was. Realized then we'd been doing vehicle design wrong. Too complex, too hard to produce and maintain. They made over 600,000 of them. A third added, "We made 50,000 Kubelwagens. That ratio says it all." They fell silent. The Jeep sat before them, a museum artifact, its war long over. But for these men, it symbolized more than history. It embodied the productive capacity that defeated them, the pragmatic engineering that proved effective, the abundance that overwhelmed scarcity. "We never had vehicles like this," one finally said. "Not in the numbers, not with the reliability, not built to that philosophy. We built for perfection. They built for production." That lesson, absorbed by Wehrmacht mechanics who examined captured Jeeps across North Africa, Italy, and France, shaped post-war Germany and influenced global industry. The Jeep had been more than a vehicle. It had been a lesson. Humiliated by defeat, German mechanics became eager students. They learned not only how to maintain American equipment, but why it had been designed that way, and what those choices revealed about the manufacturing philosophy that had won the war. Painful as it was, that knowledge became the base for Germany's Reconstruction and later prosperity. Defeat taught humility. American machinery taught functional engineering. Together, they forged a new German approach that proved far more effective than pre-war hubris. The story of Wehrmacht mechanics and the Jeep is one of learning through loss. Pride had convinced them that German engineering would beat American quantity and that sophistication would outmatch simplicity. Reality taught otherwise. American vehicles were not superior in every technical spec, but they were better suited to the realities of modern war, producible in vast numbers, serviceable by minimally trained personnel, built from common interchangeable parts and robust under abuse. That practical functionality, multiplied by America's manufacturing scale, produced an overwhelming material advantage no amount of German skill or bravery could neutralize. The Wehrmacht had capable soldiers, competent officers, and fine equipment, but it lacked the industrial base needed to sustain total war against foes who could replace equipment faster than Germany could destroy it. The mechanics who maintained both German and American machines saw this with their own hands. They had worked on vehicles born of different philosophies and knew which approach performed better in combat. That experience guided their work in rebuilding Germany, teaching young mechanics the lessons learned at hard cost, pushing for standardization and simplicity in processes, and prioritizing manufacturability and dependability when designing new products. Engineers who rebuilt Germany's automotive and machinery industries studied captured American equipment, served in prison camp motorpools, and observed U.S. production firsthand. They blended German precision with American production efficiency, and the result was extraordinarily successful. By the 1970s, West Germany had become a major exporter of manufactured goods, and its economic recovery validated lessons learned from defeat. Germany abandoned the hubris that had contributed to catastrophe and adopted practices informed by the victor's methods. The Jeep played a real role in that transformation. Every Wehrmacht mechanic who serviced a captured Jeep absorbed insights about American doctrine. Every officer who rode in one recognized its advantages. Every soldier who saw Allied abundance grasped what propaganda had obscured. Those shared experiences among hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and prisoners made clear that defeat was primarily material, not moral, and that understanding shaped Reconstruction policy. German leaders and engineers chose to adapt American methods instead of restoring pre-war practices that had proven inadequate. Embracing mass manufacturing over small-scale craft, designing for production and reliability, rather than perfection regardless of difficulty, the Wehrmacht mechanics who first met Jeeps in North African deserts could not have foreseen the long-term consequences of that encounter. Trying simply to evaluate an enemy vehicle, they uncovered truths about industrial capacity and design philosophy that would direct the rest of their lives and help rebuild their country. The last of those mechanics have now passed away and their first-hand testimonies are gone. But the lessons remain embedded in practice worldwide. Every vehicle designed for ease of manufacture owes something to the Jeep's embodied philosophy. Every standardized part bears traces of American influence. Every emphasis on durability echoes lessons learned in motorpools where Wehrmacht mechanics maintained captured equipment. The Jeep's legacy is that of a teacher. It forced scrutiny of assumptions about superiority, proved functional effectiveness often outweighs sophisticated design, and showed that designing for manufacture and maintenance serves better than designing for perfection. Those lessons helped turn Germany from vanquished foe to prosperous partner. The mechanics who admitted they had never had vehicles like the Jeep became architects of renewal. Their humility, born of defeat and sharpened by observation, served Germany far better than the pride that had preceded catastrophe. In November 1942, while examining a captured Jeep in the North African desert, Wehrmacht mechanics began a journey of discovery that influenced a generation. Their admission that they had never possessed vehicles like it marked the start of the hard-earned wisdom that rebuilt a nation.